Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Tuesday, July 14th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, the federal government is going beyond funding research. It's increasingly helping decide which technologies make it to market. But then what happens when government stops waiting for the market and starts shaping it? Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Air Force is scrambling to get its employees back online after scores of people were locked out of their computers last week. Computers across the service went into quarantine, a sort of protective shutdown that's routine as cybersecurity measure both in and out of the military. But what's not routine here is the scale of people affected and that at least some of them say they weren't warned in advance. Federal News Network's defense reporter Rachel Cohen joins me now with more. Rachel, great to have you. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Terry.
Maybe back us up a little bit. What would cause a computer to get quarantined?
So it's something that kicks in, if you don't kind of reboot your computer regularly so that the software patches and all the, kind of cyber protections can re-up. If you avoid or if you postpone those updates, right? If you don't use your computer for long enough that it says, oh, this isn't part of the secure network anymore. If you plug in something that's not authorized to be, on the NIPR or the SIPR networks, it can do it. So they're all reasonable, understandable things that would flag, cyber concerns. But the issue seems to be here if there were updates rolling out that either people weren't told about or, they went in to get their computer fixed or like updated ahead of time and it didn't stick or, what have you.
Sounds like it was pretty widespread. So what steps does someone have to take if their computer is quarantined? They have to unplug it and bring it back in?
Yeah, you have to bring it to, your comm shop and they basically run all of the updates that need to be run. They re-encrypt it so that it's, all set up. And so some of that, can be done remotely, which is most helpful for people. But in other cases, I believe for re-encryption, you have to take it in person. And so that, can throw a wrench in some things. I saw one post online from somebody who was saying, hey, I was going TDY, I was going out of town for work and I've tried multiple devices and all of them are getting shut down, and I have to bring them in person to get reopened.
It sounds like this might have a real impact on how people are able to do their jobs.
Yeah. I think there's ideally a minimal impact if there's another non-quarantined computer that you can easily hop onto. I think part of the issue that people are chattering about is not everybody in a particular office or unit got quarantined. So I've seen people saying like of the dozen or so in my shop, only one got hit. I've seen in my one classroom alone, 3 or 4 people got hit. So, hopefully the impact is not widespread enough that you can still kind of do the work on a different computer, or you can, if you're in a class or something, you can kind of piggyback on somebody else's. But if you're trying to get work done that day and it's not something that you can kind of share the burden of, you still have to stop and, take your laptop in or take your device in and you're kind of down for as long as it takes.
Are people concerned that this is a cybersecurity incident, or is this just a factor that folks haven't updated their latest Microsoft app or something like that?
Yeah, I haven't seen any concern that it's, a hack or something. Somebody posted a picture of the, your computer has been quarantined screen that is, the official screen. Yeah. So I had that question too, but I haven't seen really any conversation online about it being anything other than, just a typical kind of Air Force network, or DoD network kind of cyber response. I have asked the Air Force what caused it, and all they didn't give me specifics. So my understanding is not anything nefarious at this point.
And how has the Air Force responded to the impact across the force? So
with not as much detail as I might like, they said, we routinely update our network security. You should reboot your computer regularly. You should update regularly. You should, keep your devices online. Framed it really as, this is kind of standard network maintenance. And as we said before, I think we just haven't seen something at this scale. People get quarantined all the time, right? Like this has happened for years and years and years. But it seems like, and again, without the Air Force confirming how many people are affected, it's hard to tell. But the sense is, it's multiple bases, multiple commands, civilian, uniformed. There's more impact than kind of just a one-off, because you forgot to update your laptop or something.
Sounds like we might see the Air Force rolling out some remedial training soon.
Maybe. I think a question I have, and I feel like they should have as well, is, for the people who are saying that they didn't get warned ahead of time, why is that? Is it that somebody didn't see a message saying, hey, this is coming if you don't do X, Y, and Z? Was there a glitch that didn't warn them? Was there a glitch that they weren't supposed to be quarantined and they got quarantined anyway? So I think that's really the next step.
And how will you know if the Air Force is taking that step?
Ideally, they would answer me and say so. It's we'll see. I think people chatter online, and hopefully the Air Force will be transparent about how they're addressing an issue that keeps, online. There's an unofficial Facebook page that people frequent called Air Force Airman NCO, Senior NCO. And it's where a lot of people go to gripe, but also kind of leave a lot of interesting little tips. And, on that page says, tens of thousands. I have no idea, how, I don't know where that comes from. Like I said, the Air Force wouldn't confirm that, but I do think that whatever, kind of remedial training or whatever the cause of this is, I can guess that bits and pieces of it will come out in forums like that.
That's Federal News Network's Rachel Cohen. Rachel, thanks for bringing us this story.
Yeah, thank you.
You can find her details at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, the federal government is going beyond funding research. It's increasingly helping to decide which technologies make it to market. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. For decades, government largely funded discovery and let the market handle commercialization. NSF is now building new pathways to move promising technologies from the lab into the economy. Joining me to explain that effort is NSF's Assistant Director for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, Dr. Irwin Gyanchandani. Dr. Gyanchandani, it's so great to have you back on the show. Thanks for joining me.
Terry, thanks for having me. Really, really looking forward to the conversation today.
I am too. NSF has three recent announcements: X Labs, the SBIR relaunch, and now tech accelerators. When you put those three together, they seem closely related, but I'd love to hear from your perspective. What does NSF see as the environment here that you're trying to address?
Yeah, sure. So let me just say, as you know, I help lead the Directorate for Technology Innovation and Partnerships, the TIP Directorate at NSF that we stood up a number of years ago. And our focus within TIP specifically is around trying to be able to help accelerate the great research that's coming out of the basic sciences in the other directorates of the agency and helping to push that research out into the marketplace. And we want to do that to the point at which industry takes it up. We don't want to replicate or duplicate the great work that industry does here in the United States. But there is that sort of so-called valley of death that we're trying to be able to help researchers and students and talent get across with their great ideas and their great new discoveries and innovations. And so what you see with this portfolio in many ways is trying to be able to help plug various gaps that we see in the terrain when it comes to advancing science and technology to impact for the betterment of U.S. competitiveness and the U.S. economy in the long term.
Well, let's start up front with the X Labs. This is a very different model for NSF. What role are X Labs intended to play in this system?
Yeah, so one thing that I like to say about X Labs is, we at NSF have been on the front lines for the last 7 or 8 decades now, helping to champion basic science all across this country. And I think we have a great system that enables that. NSF funding largely academic institutions gives rise to new discoveries that we push into the industry sphere, and then industry marketizes, productizes going forward. But that's one model, right? And I think that what's really important for us is to not only be constantly innovating in the what are the new directions at the future of intelligence? What are the new directions around quantum phenomena? What are the new directions around advanced materials and matter? But also thinking about innovating in the how. How are we enabling the research enterprise in this country, growing the research enterprise in this country to be optimized and accelerate progress in these different areas? And so X Labs for us it's new, it's different. It's modeled off of some great work that's been pioneered by philanthropy around the notion of focused research organizations. Can we support independent research teams, provide them with a bit of a runway, some milestones that they have to hit that they self-describe, but provide them with a bit of runway so that they're not constantly in the mode of having to apply for research grants every few years out of NSF or other funding agencies, but rather they have a very specific challenge or hurdle that they're trying to overcome in science and technology, and be able to give them that runway to work at that. A team that's multidisciplinary, engaged from across different sectors, even academia, industry, et cetera, working together to be able to overcome that and ultimately get to the point of sort of a platform capability or technology that can unlock entirely new sectors of science or entirely new sectors of technology going forward.
So this sounds like a very basic science level of work.
Well, so I think what we're looking at is being able to, if you look at the couple of topic areas that we've already announced, one is around scientific instrumentation in particular. Really excited about imaging and sensing and how might we unlock entirely new approaches to imaging and sensing that could in turn feed back into basic scientific discovery and allow us to be able to map new biological concepts, new chemistry concepts, map the physical world in a variety of different ways going forward. And so I think we're looking to be able to get to platform capabilities where you're maybe familiar with technology readiness levels. The TRLs might help us move from 2 to 6, for instance, 2 to 5, 2 to 6, but at the same time, in this particular case with sensing and imaging around scientific instrumentation, that will then feed back into the scientific enterprise and drive further basic scientific discovery going forward. Quantum phenomena, the other topic that we have, again, trying to look at if we're really interested on the heels of the president signing an executive order earlier this week around quantum, for instance, if we're really interested in next generation quantum computing, sensing capabilities that have practical applications, One of the areas that's sort of a platform challenge, if you will, is around quantum interconnects and quantum photonics, allowing us to be able to stitch together these capabilities going forward. And so there's an area where we're really hoping for a team or multiple teams to be able to help move the research forward from a TRL around 2 or 3 up to 5 or 6 to be able to get us to the point that we can really have the inroads and the impacts around quantum technology that we all hope to see. And through all of this, there will be, we hope, feedback loops that will drive further basic science and feed forward loops that will drive further translational work as well.
Dr. Irwin Gyanchandani is NSF's Assistant Director for Technology, Innovation, and Partnership. So understanding then what X Labs is supposed to do, you've relaunched SBIR and STTR with another $250 million. How do those two programs connect?
Yeah, so we're really excited about SBIR, STTR, and this relaunch, Terry. And I think we're really excited also for all of these portfolio programs that you're referencing. We have worked very closely with our colleagues at the White House and the Office of Science and Technology Policy and have some strong support from the leadership there as well. So you know full well that the SBIR program saw its authorization lapse at the end of September of last year, and we went through a process. Congress passed legislation. The president signed it into law back in April, and so we have been able to now, over the last month or so, reboot our SBIR program here at NSF. I'm proud of the fact that NSF helped pioneer the SBIR program for the rest of the federal government back in the 1970s and 1980s. And today the program has been adopted by 11 or so other agencies that invest in R&D. So our investment, $250 million, goes towards some of the earliest stage startups just coming out of the research lab, trying to find a path forward to really develop their technology to the point that it can be picked up by mergers and acquisitions and others in the industrial space, or these startups can become flourishing companies in their own rights as well. I'll note that Qualcomm, a leading wireless company today, has its roots in an NSF SBIR many decades ago. But what's exciting about this particular relaunch is that we have set aside about $40 million of our portfolio this year specifically to focus on a pilot effort around scientific instrumentation. So you sort of see a recurring theme across some of our programs that we're talking about today. We've heard from the research community the need to be able to not only fund the science, but fund the instrumentation that allows us to be able to unlock great new discoveries going forward. And what we find oftentimes is that in the space of scientific instrumentation, there may not be that strong venture capital community that's ready to go after some of these early stage startups. And so we've invested in this space in the past, but we're really putting an emphasis or spotlight on it as part of our SBIR relaunch to say, if you have some emerging ideas from basic scientific discovery that could lead to better instrumentation, more precise measurement, more precise sensing, more precise imaging, or the next lab view, for example, in certain trade spaces, certain fields of science and engineering. Well, bring that idea forward. We'd love to help you de-risk it, help you get it to the point where it's now able to feed back into the scientific enterprise going forward.
And then it sounds like the third leg of the stool is the Tech Accelerator Program. This is very different. How does it connect or take those two programs to the next level?
Well, so I would say that I think each one of these programs is an initiative in its own right that, as I mentioned earlier, is really about trying to help move science to its greatest form of impact at the end of the day. X Labs is taking that bet on a set of teams, really focusing on the teams and the ambitions of those teams around some platform technologies that we're looking to help accelerate. SBIR, maybe you have some startups that emerge, for instance, from an X Lab. You want to be able to see those startups further develop some of the outputs to the point that they're now in the commercial market space. Tech accelerators for us is a little bit different, but related, as you pointed out. Here, the focus is, let's look at some of the areas that maybe we know the venture capital community is not investing as heavily in today, right? If you look at some of the trends over the last year or two, a lot of investment in AI, for example, a lot of increasing investment in quantum and aerospace and defense and so forth. But there are other areas that are of critical importance to the nation's competitiveness in the long term as well, that we also need to make sure we are helping to push ideas into the mainstream. So, for example, let's consider the space of ocean technologies, right? Maritime technology. We've seen in the last few months the significance of this area, for example. And so here's an opportunity for us to essentially invest in an accelerator type organization, new partnerships that are coming together, bringing perhaps the VC community, perhaps private sector interests, perhaps academic researchers, new partnerships that could coalesce together to form an accelerator that has the expertise to help guide in turn a set of teams that are working in that space around ocean and maritime tech, and help those teams, much smaller teams focused on specific problems or specific use cases, help those teams push their ideas into the market space as quickly as possible. I would hope that a tech accelerator, for instance, might connect in with the SBIR program. It might connect in with our NSF I-Core program as well, which is providing folks with the opportunity to get sort of this exposure around how you do customer discovery to understand what your market niche is for your idea that you are pursuing. So the tech accelerator really is trying to help bridge multiple micro valleys, if you will, in the valley of death, helping researchers in these focused areas like maritime tech or ag tech or materials tech, or another one, a common refrain, scientific instrumentation, sci-tech we're calling it here, help them be able to get the mentoring and the support to take their concept and move it forward along that pathway.
Each of these is an exciting initiative in its own right, but when you put them together, there really is a pattern, a desire to take technology and move it to market scale. If it works, if all of them work the way you envision them, what do you think will be different 3 or 5 years from now in the scientific research space?
Well, I'm hoping that over time, I would actually take each one of these a little bit separately, right? I would say with X Labs, for instance, we're taking all of these are pilot efforts, to be fair, but with X Labs, we're taking a bet on teams to be able to unlock new ideas. And a few years ago, a decade ago or so, there was the discovery of CRISPR-Cas in the biotechnology domain, which is today revolutionizing how we think about pharmaceuticals and other agricultural food production and so forth, right? That discovery took many decades and many grant cycles to be able to get to that point. And I think with X Labs, we're hoping that especially if we pick the right topics, X Labs shaped topics as we're describing them, we will be able to accelerate that type of outcome and really allow these teams to come together and short circuit having to constantly fight for grant funding over and over again to get to that output. With SBIR, it would be fabulous if we end up with a robust portfolio 5 years from now of entirely new scientific instruments that are now commercialized to the point that they are benefiting the scientific enterprise. And perhaps there are other such topics that we could consider as well. And with tech accelerators, I think part of our goal here is to be able to crowd in funding, leverage co-funding, leverage additional resources from venture capital and other investors. So to be able to bring them into some of these technology spaces where perhaps there's a bit less focus, a bit less interest today, but they are nevertheless really critical for U.S. competitiveness in the long term. So 5 years from now, seeing more investment in these spaces and seeing the outputs of those investments being realized in real world senses, I think those would be some stellar outcomes from these efforts.
Dr. Irwin Gyanchandani is NSF's Assistant Director for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. Thanks so much for joining me today and walking through these programs with us.
Well, thanks for having me, Terry. Thanks as always for your interest. And I say to your listeners, we're open for business. We look forward to engaging with them on these efforts going forward.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, a more active government role in innovation raises an old question. How do you move faster without losing accountability? But first, the government's role in innovation may be changing from customer to investor. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. If agencies are no longer willing to wait for markets alone to deliver critical technologies, what comes next? Some are moving upstream, investing in companies and technologies much earlier than traditional procurement would allow. For a look at what that means for industry and government alike, Bloomberg Government's senior data analyst Paul Murphy joins me now. Paul, it is great to have you back on the show. Thanks for joining me today.
Terry, good to see you.
We're going to talk about something that's getting some attention but not a lot of discussion, the government taking equity stakes in private corporations. For years, the government just showed up as a buyer. You built something and they decided whether or not they were going to buy it. Now it's showing up earlier and helping finance the company itself. What has changed in the market and the ecosystem that made that shift seem necessary to the government?
The OSC, the Office of Strategic Capital within DOD, is a statutorily authorized program. It's been around since the latter part of the Biden administration. But you're right, it represents a fundamental shift in the government's procurement role from simply buying products to helping decide which companies receive federal financing before contracts are even awarded. That may accelerate critical technologies, but it also gives the government much greater influence over which firms succeed in the marketplace.
The government's always been focused on objectivity, clear, transparent terms, and may the best company win. This feels a little bit like taking bets earlier in the process. What's the concern there?
Well, it could change competition in important ways because companies backed by government loans or equity, it's not just, taking investment stakes, but it's also a large part of it right now is loans. These companies that receive this financing could gain advantages in attracting private investors, expanding production, and even winning future contracts. The concern is that firms without access to those programs may find themselves competing on an uneven playing field long before a government procurement even begins.
And you made an interesting point there. It also changes the government's incentive in the longer term. As an equity holder, they have an interest in the long-term profitability of this company, which may change how they consider future investments or purchases, right?
Yes. We've seen in the past, there's particularly in the late aughts, where the government took equity stakes in solar companies. I believe it was Solyndra, and that didn't pan out financially. Congress isn't questioning the goal of strengthening the industrial base as much as they're asking who decides where these billions of dollars go and whether the decisions are free from political influence or conflicts of interest. Once the government becomes both an investor and a customer, lawmakers are worried that oversight becomes more complicated and the public confidence in the procurement process can be harder to maintain. And DOD's 2027 budget proposal requested $20 billion for the Office of Strategic Capital. But the $20 billion is not the discretionary money. That's the mandatory money that would be used for loan subsidies. And so if OSC and they're projecting that $20 billion could be leveraged into $200 billion in loan authority, which was like nearly a quarter of the total value of procurement in fiscal 2025. So they're assuming like a 10 times leverage ratio. And when they make loans, they're saying that $20 billion could turn into $200 billion in loans. They're assuming a very low failure rate on the projects that this money would fund. I mean, they're assuming that the government is only on the hook for, 1 million out of every $10 million that they loan. That's very low. And historically, I think that's proven to be questionable given, the government's experience in equity investments. So the leverage ratio is very optimistic. The oversight is minimal. The money is going through a mandatory or is proposed to go through a mandatory budget account. Congress still has to decide that that's not set in stone just yet. That's not actual appropriations. That's, money that still has to be awarded. So, and then with all the questions coming from, members of Congress, from Elizabeth Warren and others, I think there's going to be more discussion about just how realistic the leverage ratio is, predictions of success and failure, conflicts of interest, of course, and a general accountability. How is this investment money? How are the decisions being made to award this investment money?
Paul Murphy is a senior data analyst at Bloomberg Government. Paul, as we're setting the stage here, both kind of conceptually and practically, this practice isn't distributed across government. It's really focused in some very specific areas. Walk us through the agencies that are playing here and the industries where this is focused.
Well, there are dozens of what are called critical defense technologies. I believe the original list started out over 40. They've tweaked it and consolidated down, to anywhere from, six to maybe a dozen. But it's technologies that DoD has identified, particularly DoD, but also the Department of Energy and Commerce have identified that are critical to U.S. national security because they feel that the U.S. is falling behind China and other companies in the production of rare earths. The U.S. has been significantly dependent on China for rare earth materials, but they're also concerned about magnets that go into drones and navigation equipment. They're concerned about quantum computing and the ability of quantum computers made by foreign companies to hack highly secure U.S. computers and networks. So I think what's driving this is a perception, that the U.S. has gaps in its ability to fulfill its security requirements, and so they're looking to, try and leverage investments, loans, and equity investments to pace the production of these weapons and equipment more in line with the pace of commercial procurement.
And so how does this financing approach get at that solution set, right? Rather than just buying and giving firms contracts to help them explore and develop these critical technologies, why is the current thinking that it's better to have an equity stake? How does that change the production problem?
Well, I think part of the idea, I don't claim to have all the answers, but I think part of the idea is that by giving companies money ahead of actual procurements, it gives them the ability to decide where to invest that money, whether they need to invest it in plant and equipment, in people, in training, in supply chain modernization. It gives them more control. But it flips the model, the traditional model of federal procurement from what has been the case since the Cold War, where the government decides what it needs and prioritizes, sets the strategy and sets the policies and decides what equipment it needs and establishes requirements for particular kinds of weapons. And so it puts a lot more power, control, and even influence in the hands of the private sector, where the government is now looking for the private sector to tell it what it should buy and trying to keep pace with the technology that the industry in the commercial sector is creating. And I think this may have grown out in part because of shortcomings it sensed in its ability to do counter-missile attacks during the Israeli, but also the Iraq War. But especially more recently, I think there's been a lot of discussion about the use of drones in Ukraine and the ability to counter massive drone attacks from foreign countries into Ukraine and what technologies are needed to do that. And then building from that, you have the surveillance and the magnets and the rare earths that are needed to power the batteries and the equipment in these very much smaller scale pieces of equipment. So I think that's in part what's driving this.
In conventional acquisition, we have a long history of how that process is supposed to work, who's competitive, how you compete. As we shift to this more equity-focused investment approach, does that change who is going to be able to do business with the government and how they do business with the government?
Potentially, yes. If a relatively small number of companies become the preferred recipients of government financing, it could accelerate consolidation, make it harder for new entrants to compete, and shift capital towards firms viewed as government favorites rather than those the market would have selected on its own. So we've seen a lot of consolidation in the federal supply chain over the last several years, particularly with small businesses. And, this could tilt markets, capital markets, toward, these kinds of, technologies that strategically selected companies are able to produce. There's the whole question of, who's deciding, what companies should be strategically selected becomes very important. And then that's where I think Congress is particularly concerned is who's making the decisions and on what basis are these decisions being made.
And from what you're seeing, is this a temporary shift in focus, or does this really mark a long-term transformation of the government contracting market?
Well, I look at the funding to try and answer this in part. And, Congress has preserved this OSC funding, this $20 billion for now, but it has not embraced this expansion. It suggests that lawmakers want to move more cautiously than the Pentagon has requested. The debate is increasingly shifting from whether government investment should exist to how large it should be. I think that's the question Congress wants to discuss most urgently, and discuss what safeguards are needed, how to ensure financing decisions remain transparent, how to ensure competition in the procurement process, and how to keep it insulated from political influence. Because we've seen in some of these loans, for instance, the big Vulcan Elements loan back in November 2025, where OSC issued a $620 million conditional loan, for the development, the build out of supply chains for rare earth magnets. One of the investors in that, one of the backers of that company is 1789 Capital, where Donald Trump Jr. is a partner. And members of Congress have, asked DOD for more accountability in how these decisions are being made and what potential conflicts of interest might exist.
Paul Murphy is a senior data analyst at Bloomberg Government. Paul, I really appreciate you giving us a little bit more insight into a really important issue.
Well, thanks, Terry. This is a developing issue. There's a lot of different angles to this. We've just looked at OSC, but there's a half a dozen organizations doing this, and I hope we have a chance to talk about it again in the future.
I'm sure we will. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, a more active government role in innovation raises an old question. How do you move faster without losing accountability? This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. As agencies experiment with new approaches to technology, finance, and acquisition, the rules that govern grants and contracts are changing too. The challenge is making sure oversight keeps pace with innovation. Professional Services Council President Stephanie Castro joins me now with the latest take on these issues. Stephanie, great to have you on this morning.
Thanks, Terry, for having me.
We've been talking today about how the federal government is expanding its role from buyer to investor as a way to speed the development of new technologies. It's also revamping its relationship with grantees. From your perspective there at PSC, what's driving the change in the uniform guidance that's out now?
Well, thanks for asking this question, Terry, because this proposed rule came out of the Office of Management and Budget weeks ago. It actually came out in late May, and comments are due yesterday. And so this is very fresh in my mind here. And that is to say, this proposed rule on federal financial assistance does tackle the uniform guidance, or what we used to call uniform guidance. What OMB is trying to do is to take some of the big moving pieces that were in uniform guidance and put them into regulation. So there were lots and lots of clauses for us to comment on the sort of question of moving from customer to investor or getting skin in the game. It's a really interesting take on grants and cooperative agreements, what we loosely call federal financial assistance. So it's not a contract, but a lot of contractors are involved as partners to research institutions, R&D centers, nonprofits, and different kinds of organizations. And so this is a really interesting take, what OMB is trying to do here with what was used to be called the uniform guidance.
And what has industry seen as the biggest changes, or where did you find the biggest opportunity for comment?
So what I find interesting, there are, I would say, at least three things, Terry, that jumped out to me immediately. One is that this proposed rule would prohibit fixed price or fixed amount grants. This is it's a direct difference from where we're going with contracts. You may recall, Terry, that there was an executive order, and now there's additional activity happening to move to contracts to fixed price contracts. And so what jumped out at me about this proposed rule is that it takes using the same rationale for transparency, accountability, oversight, is actually saying we can't do, or we shouldn't do, fixed amount grants. So that did jump out to us. And that's important for a few reasons. A lot of these research institutions, or those who receive federal financial assistance in this way, don't have the cost compliance structures that have built up like contractors do. And so this is something that they're going to struggle with. So it's certainly something we commented on. The second is major piece about accountability is talking about what those partnering relationships look like. Recipients, subrecipients, partners, how contractors come to play in terms of grants management. So that jumped out to me as well. And then finally, and I mentioned this earlier, which is this had been guidance before. There's no basis in statute. So OMB is going and putting this into regulations without a statutory basis. And that jumped out at me as something that with the revolutionary FAR overhaul, trying to strip down the FAR and federal regulations to anything based in statute, this is a little bit of a departure from that approach.
It really does sound like the two sides of grants and contracts are taking a different approach here.
It does seem that way, and it's something that we've highlighted in our comments that we submitted by the deadline of July 13th. And so, we are working with OMB and the agencies to figure out what right looks like here. Industry is a key player in this domain, along with grant recipients and those who are operating under cooperative agreements. And so the universe is small. There are a lot of stakeholders. There are hundreds of thousands of comments already submitted. And so OMB is going to have its work cut out for itself when it goes through all of this.
Stephanie Castro is the president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, let's take another regulatory role right now, another regulatory look. GSA is collecting feedback on its proposed AI safeguarding clause. What's the concern here that industry most wants government to understand before that clause becomes final?
There is a lot happening in this space, Terry, and you may recall you and I had a conversation back in March when GSA released its initial version of this clause, and they got lots and lots of comments on that one as well. As we move through, it's an interesting take on it. This version that we are reviewing right now came out on June 17th. It is much more narrowly focused than the March version was, and this one focuses on a couple of key differences between the March version and this version. This clause currently would replace a strict foreign ban on AI for large language models with a U.S. incorporation preference, right, to skew towards more of a Buy America or American-made preference. This is in reinforcement of an executive order about U.S. leadership in AI. So we're not surprised by this one. Another deviation from, although it's contracting, I shouldn't say deviation, right? That's a term of art. I'll say another difference from the March version is that it adds an emphasis on, quote, unbiased AI principles. So we're unpacking that as well. And then finally, there are some strict human access limits talking about government data ownership and use restrictions. That is something, intellectual property is always something that resonates with the contracting community about who owns what and under what licensing agreements can and should it be shared.
Stephanie, there's a listening session on this rule today. What are you hoping to hear there? And what is PSC looking for as this rule gets finalized?
Industry was very excited to understand that GSA was hosting both an in-person and virtual listening session here on July 14th. And we are hoping to learn a little bit about the origin, what the intent is, and what the rollout and enforcement requirements will be. Comments are due August 3rd, the written comments are. And so we at PSC are going to have a session just for our member companies in the days following today's listening session to talk about what contractors should do. Things like both contractors and their supply chain participants looking at their large language model arrangements and considering comments on provisions that would burden operational or compliance requirements. That said, when we commented in March, I suspect our comments are going to be similar in a couple of veins. One is we don't want to limit commercial AI solutions and innovation. And so we're going to be listening today for that kind of commentary from GSA. We don't want policies to conflict with other AI guidance coming out from OMB and agencies themselves. And then finally, we don't want a one-size-fits-all. These companies are evolving very, very quickly. Their technology is evolving very, very quickly. And we don't want to hamstring American industry in artificial intelligence because there is such a race globally to be a leader in this space.
It's certainly going to be an important session today. But let's turn our attention to one more acquisition issue here. GAO's released its latest annual assessment on DoD acquisition reform, And it, maybe not surprisingly, finds that DoD continues to struggle with delays, even as it's pursuing acquisition reform. From your perspective, what's keeping those reforms from translating into faster fielding of capabilities?
Terry, you've heard me say this before. If last year, if 2025 was the year of efficiency, 2026 is both the year of innovation and the year of speed. And we've heard folks like Secretary Hegseth and others talk about quicker delivery time, shorter delivery windows to get technologies and solutions in the hands of warfighters. This is GAO's 24th annual weapons systems assessment, and the timelines are growing. And it's amazing to me that for some major defense acquisition programs, we are looking at 12 years to go from conceptualization to fielding some of this essential equipment and solutions. And so, what is getting in the way of this? A lot of it is bureaucracy. A lot of it is requirements are changing. And so therefore, you've got to add engineering change orders, or you've got to put in additional time windows. I think part of it is we have a tendency over time to let the perfect be the enemy of the good enough. And we really need to focus on, as we're going through development cycles, what is good enough to move forward? It may not be perfect, but we have time to get it perfect. But let's not hold up the entire value chain or the entire delivery schedule just on that. And so I think if you look at some of the programs that GAO highlighted, you'll see exactly what I mean here in terms of the T-7 jet training program. We're looking at hypersonic attack cruise missiles. We're looking at air defense, long-range hypersonic weapons. These are huge programs. They're going to be snags, but how do we move quickly? And I don't think we have the agility here. And certainly we don't have the acquisition workforce in the same way we did a while ago. And I think the department is doing everything it can to hire into those positions so that we can move faster.
Stephanie, thanks for kind of taking us back to where we started, which is one of the ways the government is trying to get after that speed is by investing sooner in the development process. So we'll see how this all turns out.
I'm waiting with bated breath. And to the extent that, a trade association like PSC and our sister associations can feed into this and be helpful, I think it's going to be essential. A lot of stakeholders in this area, and I think we all deserve to be heard. We have great ideas, and it's a way that we can move forward together.
Stephanie Castro is president of the Professional Services Council. Stephanie, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The rules governing discipline and removal procedures for federal employees are on track for a major overhaul. A slew of proposed regulations and executive orders from the Trump administration, along with recent court decisions and upcoming hearings, are reshaping how agencies handle adverse action processes for the federal workforce. Here to break down all the details is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Good to be with you, Terry.
Kind of doing a personnel policy roundup here. So let's take these issues one at a time. One recent proposal looks to overhaul the procedures agencies use when firing employees. So tell us more about this plan from the administration.
Well, this is something that we saw recently from the Office of Personnel Management in combination with the Merit Systems Protection Board. They issued joint proposed regulations recently that really look to change the appeals process at MSPB by removing what are called the Douglas factors. Now, these are 12 considerations that go back to 1981 that generally agencies will use when they're justifying adverse actions that they might take against a federal employee. But now in these new proposed regulations from MSPB and OPM, they say that the Douglas factors have made the discipline policies too rigid, and they're proposing instead to determine whether an agency's adverse action was reasonable based on a case-by-case basis and not have specific factors that need to be addressed in every case. So that's something where OPM has said that this is a step towards efficiency and to make sure that there's a fair and consistent process. But of course, on the other side of the coin here, we also have some critics saying that this is going to open the doors to more bias, more inconsistency, and potentially politically motivated firings of employees. So really a lot to work with here on what they're proposing.
Drew, how does that then fit with the recent final rule, which changes the suitability and fitness regulations? Are they connected?
They're not necessarily connected to one another, but it is notable that there's this trend towards really overhauling what federal firing policies and adverse action policies look like in government. So on the one hand, you do have this removal of Douglas factors and some changes to the appeals process over at MSPB. But at the same time, OPM is also moving forward with overhauling suitability and fitness regulations. So it's another area where they're not necessarily related, but they seem to be steps towards a similar end goal here. So what this final rule does is say that now federal employees, on top of what has historically been just federal job applicants, can now be disciplined or fired for misconduct based on what are called suitability and fitness standards. So traditionally, there's reasons such as criminal and violent conduct, excessive alcohol use, deception, fraud, things like that can disqualify a federal job applicant. Now those same factors apply to agencies' considerations of potentially removing active and current federal employees as well. And on top of just expanding who those regulations apply to, OPM's final rule also adds more factors that agencies can consider to decide whether federal employees can remain in their jobs or not. So that includes things like if they file their taxes on time, if they meet citizenship requirements, and then one notable one is compliance with any non-disclosure obligations. And one thing to remember there is that there's a separate proposal from OPM proposing a government-wide non-disclosure agreement or NDA for federal employees as well.
So it sounds like they're moving towards a lot more discretion for the manager in these cases. That also seems to be at the root of schedule policy career, which is now in effect as well, where these folks move to at-will employment status.
Absolutely. It does seem like a trend line there is this idea of flexibility, of adding more options for managers or agency leaders to remove employees if they find, for example, under the schedule policy career section, if they believe that certain federal employees in these policy influencing positions, as they call them, if they are actually carrying out the president's priorities, or if they might be, for example, not fulfilling their job duties, then they could be fired without the agencies needing to give any advance notice or any reason for that. So that is certainly a step towards what Trump administration officials want to see as accountability and as flexibility, as I mentioned, but that's also causing a lot of concerns as well about this broadening influence of, political control over the federal workforce, concerns about removing what have been pretty substantial protections for career civil servants, and just, increases of the risk of bias in the work that agencies or employees put out. There's a lot of concerns about how this is going to impact things. And if I could also just mention briefly that the schedule policy career executive order changed over about 8,000 federal positions. But there has been some reporting more recently, for example, from Bloomberg, showing that Trump administration officials are already looking to potentially expand that number. There's no specific number, no specific timeline on that, but that's starting or seeming to get into the works as well here.
Andrew, maybe the last big event at the end of the Supreme Court term were a couple of decisions that changed the firing rules in other ways as well. What are we seeing there?
If you look at the Slaughter Supreme Court decision that came out just a couple of weeks ago, that was really a decision that paved the way for expanded presidential power to fire the heads of independent agencies. So this involved the leader of the Federal Trade Commission, Rebecca Slaughter, who the president fired last year without giving a reason, despite federal law requiring that. And that decision from the Supreme Court applies to other independent agencies as well, where Trump has also fired leaders, for example, the Merit Systems Protection Board, National Labor Relations Board, Consumer Product Safety Commission. So that decision has the potential to reshape a lot of these agencies that have historically been independent as well.
I almost hesitate to ask, but when you connect all of those dots, what picture are you seeing?
It definitely seems to be a picture where, agencies and really the Trump administration, I suppose, is trying to, in their words, add more flexibility or accountability for employees. But it's something where it's going to mean a lot more questions or concerns maybe from federal employees as well, who have, had these same protections for decades, for in many cases their entire careers, and to have that change not just in one way but across a lot of different factors. I'm sure that there's some employees who are very concerned about their job security now as a result of this and potentially being fired. I've spoken with a few who have talked about concerns about how this is going to impact the work that they do day to day. It's bleeding into their thoughts and their productivity, where they're worried about potentially being fired or reprimanded for something rather than just focusing simply on the agency mission. So that's something where we've at least heard from a couple people about that, but I'd imagine that that's a much broader sentiment as well.
And is there anything else coming down the pike that folks should be worried about?
A couple things that are still coming down the pipeline here are changes to overhaul the appeals processes for employee removals. OPM has issued proposed regulations to change this when it happens based on a suitability or fitness action, when there's a probationary period firing, and when there is a removal during a reduction in force. In all three of those cases, OPM is looking to make itself the exclusive authority to decide on employee appeals in those cases. So, for example, if an employee believes they were wrongly removed in one of those cases, they would normally appeal to the Merit Systems Protection Board independently, but OPM is looking to change that authority to itself. So in that case, across those three different proposals seems to be just OPM trying to consolidate the authority there. And what it says is a way to streamline the process, but also has gained concerns as well on that front.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, really appreciate you connecting all the dots here for us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.